Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This panel is going to be on space threats and challenges. And we are very excited to have a very good group of panelists here with us. I am happy to introduce you to them. The first one is here with us in person today. Zhou is a legal advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross. Joining us virtually are Benjamin Silverstein, who is a research analyst for the space project at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Haiyang Lei, he is the deputy director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. And I'm also pleased to introduce our moderator for today, who will also be joining us virtually, Victoria Samson. Victoria is the Washington Office Director at the Secure World Foundation. Thank you very much, Victoria. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Samson. As was introduced, I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. The Secure World Foundation is a private foundation that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We push for best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all for the long term. We've been involved in co-organizing this conference for over a decade now, and I'm just delighted to be able to continue this partnership. It's been fascinating to see how this conversation has evolved as the space domain itself has changed and evolved. This panel on space threats and challenges, I'm particularly excited about. Perhaps I'm a little biased because my organization puts out a global counterspace threat assessment that I'm the co-editor of, but I think this topic is extremely timely and very relevant when we're discussing the security and stability of the space domain. And just a little background, over the past year, several countries have carried out tests of counterspace technology, as well as ambiguous operations that have raised alarms and incite protests and criticisms. Many state space policies continue to shift towards treating outer space as a contested, operational, or even warfighting domain. This panel will discuss drivers of military competition in space, including geopolitical rivalries, enabling capabilities, and the accelerated development of arms. We've got a fantastic panel to go over some of the topics. I'm going to introduce our speakers to you. We're going to have some opening remarks. Then I ask if the audience has questions, please submit them to Q&A, or if you're in person, raise your placards when we get to that point, and we'll try and call on you. The first speaker is Mr. Haiyang. He's the Deputy Division Director of the Department of Arms Control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China, mainly dealing with issues on outer space security and conventional arms control. He has held this position since 2019. Prior to his current position, Mr. Lai was posted to the Embassy of China to Pakistan from 2012 to 2017 and worked in the Department of Arms Control of Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 2009 to 2012. Mr. Lai graduated from the Communication University of China in 2009 with a master's degree in law. Mr. Lai, the floor is yours.
Okay, first, thanks, Moderator, for giving me the floor. First, I would like to take this opportunity to express my thanks to the UNIDIA for bringing us together to this conference, which provide a good platform to discuss issues related to space security. And it's my pleasure and honor to join the panel and share the view of space threats and challenges from Chinese perspective. Through the background and introduction, I think it seems that we have a common understanding that the weaponization and arms race in outer space becomes more prominent and pressing, and it's evident in three aspects. Firstly, outer space has been increasingly regarded as a new battlefield. As we know, there's one country publicly declared outer space as a new war-fighting domain, established an independent space force and space command, and accelerated the building up of a combat system in outer space. Some other countries also follow suit in establishing a new space command or space force. The NATO, for the first time, defined space as an operational domain and enhanced synergistic operational capabilities with its allies. Such actions has exacerbated the trend of an arms race in outer space and increased the risk of turning space into a warfighting domain. Secondly, the vulnerability of outer space security is rising. The development of anti-satellite weapons, missile defense systems, and long-range precision attacks weapons has posed challenges to traditional strategic balance and stability. The U.S. was the first country to conduct the anti-satellite weapon test, and with the most numbers of tests conducted, it created the largest amount of space debris so far. In its missile defense document, the U.S. discloses plans to build a network of space-based infrared sensors and deploy space-based missile interceptors. In recent years, the U.S. has been upgrading its space tests, including repeatedly testing the X-37B spacecraft and deploying upgraded counter-communication system. This technology can be diverted to offensive military use in space, and thus posing a serious threat to the security of outer space assets. Thirdly, the risk of confrontation and conflict in outer space is rising. In terms of a strategy, the U.S. is pursuing space dominance strategy, pursuing the absolute superiority, absolute freedom, and unilateral security in outer space. That will undermine the security interest of other countries or even the common security of the international community, and will exacerbate the trend of arms race. In terms of action, you see, the U.S. conducted the RPO, and flyovers activities that endanger other countries' satellites on orbit. Such actions have posed serious threats to the space assets of other countries, aggravated tension in space, and increased the risk of a military miscalculation and conflict. Before I stop, I will add one more point. We strongly believe space war cannot be won and must not be fought. The history of the nuclear arms race should never be repeated in space. All nations share broad common interest in outer space. We should preserve space as a new frontier for cooperation rather than a battlefield for competition and confrontation. China stands ready to cooperate with relevant parties to promote the negotiation of a legally binding instrument on perils at an early date, so as to address to safeguard the peace, security, and sustainability of outer space in the fundamental way. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot of interesting points brought up that I'm sure the panel will want to discuss more fully as we get to the Q&A. Our next speaker is Benjamin Silverstein. Benjamin is the research analyst for the Space Project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His work explores prospects for multilateral cooperation on issues like space situational awareness and orbital debris mitigation. His other research includes investigating arms racing dynamics. Before joining Carnegie, Benjamin Silverstein worked on international space issues at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. He completed his MA International Relations at Syracuse University and received his BA in International Affairs from George Washington University. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you to Unity for arranging the conference. I'm thrilled to be back in a virtual setting, at least. I wish I was there in person, and especially for keeping the arms race discussion on the forefront. It's one of my favorite vexing topics. And also especially thank you to the fellow panelists for their contributions and for their opinions. I really appreciate hearing that, and to the former panel for talking about Paris as well. Overall, my views on the threats and challenges to outer space are based on an assumption that I think will resonate with most of you, if not all of you, and that's when we look at space, and particularly at states' uses of space, including how they use space, why they use space, and their respective reliance on space systems, we can see that the status quo is changing. And in parallel, existing geopolitical rivalries among states have extended into space, and that's accelerating this rate of change. And the combination of these two phenomena erodes stability in space, and that's a bad thing. To be clear, I contend that we are watching an arms race unfold, and especially one that extends into space, and we're probably past the point at which it's prudent to focus our main efforts on preventing that arms race, and rather, we would likely derive more benefits if efforts were focused on limiting the consequences of that arms race in space. And to this end, I really think that states should be using the relevant organs of the United Nations and even focusing on working at the Conference on Disarmament to clarify their relationships with each other, to clarify their intents in space, and to contend with how their actions are perceived by other states, especially those actions in space or those actions that affect space. There's a lot of work to be done domestically as well in these states, developing doctrines with the arms race in mind and purposefully adopting strategies that don't inflame the arms race. Those are two really important aspects that I again, am very grateful for the last panel who focused on that pretty well. And if I can just build this out a little bit more, as we respond to this arms race, our options really concentrate on two pretty distinct activities. On the one hand, we can try to arrest the arms race, and in parallel, we can work on dampening the negative impacts of arms racing as a phenomenon. And without foreclosing on that first option, how can we accomplish the second aspect, which is attenuating the explosive potential of an arms race in space, which would hopefully, one would hope at least, have corresponding effects on checking the progression of the arms race altogether. So these are two pretty reinforcing aspects here. And I think that one of the best ways that we can do this is to reassess and revisit the relationships among rivals. That would be a really fruitful exercise towards this end. And as states' uses of space have shifted and grown over the past few decades, we should expect that their intent in conducting space activities and their decision-making processes that allow them or facilitate their uses of space, we should expect that those have also matured. And that's why it's really important to keep reassessing and revisiting these relationships. Because if we fail to recognize how and why these strategies have changed over time, and we continue to apply old or outdated paradigms to evolving interstate relationships, we are surely on the path towards extreme miscalculation and misperception, and that really only leads to a bad place. I think one of the other aspects about space that makes it so unique in this case is that the often opaque nature of these activities that happen in orbit sometimes make it very difficult to infer why a state took a specific action or why that choice supports their overall broader strategy. So again, the first step towards dampening the effects of an arms race, which would hopefully have collateral effects on arresting the arms race in the first place, is for the arms racers and the potential future arms racers themselves to clarify the relationship. And the UN, certain organs in the UN, the Conference on Disarmament, these are really well-positioned organizations that can play a pivotal role, and states really should avail themselves of these forums. And I think that one of the reasons that this is a great option is that getting better relationships and clarifying intent really doesn't need a formal document. That's one of the things that we've seen struggles in the Conference on Disarmament. A lot of the treaties and other agreements have been delayed by concerns about verification or other aspects. But if we can get a better level setting of relationships, we probably don't need to do that through formal documentation or through treaties with consensus documents. And I can get into some other aspects of this later in the questions. But thank you for your time. Looking forward to hearing the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Ben. Last for our opening remarks is our third speaker, Dr. Zhou. She is currently the legal advisor of the Arms and Conduct of Hostilities Unit, the legal division of the International Committee of the Red Cross, headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. She is author of the ICRC position paper on potential human cost of use of weapons in outer space and the protection afforded by international humanitarian law, supports the United Nations on issues outlined in GA Resolution 7536. Prior to working at the headquarters, she was head of the legal department at the ICRC Regional Delegation for East Asia based in Beijing. Prior to joining the ICRC, Wen worked as an associate legal counsel in the World Bank Group, an associate professor of law in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She holds a PhD in international law and a Bachelor of Law from Peking University, and a Master of European Law from the University of Paris, Panthéon-Sorbonne. She also studied in the Hague Academy of International Law and the Royal Wellenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law of London University. Wen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for your very kind introduction. On behalf of the ICRC, allow me to thank UNIDIR for inviting me to participate in this very interesting discussion. And indeed, the ICRC values the importance of continued discussion on outer space security. As Victoria has mentioned, this is also why earlier this year we have submitted and published a position paper on IHL and outer space. I would like to contribute to this discussion of the panel from a humanitarian and legal perspective. I think the previous speakers have already demonstrated that for decades, military uses of space objects have been an integral part of warfare. But as the role of space systems in military operations during a conflict increases, the likelihood of this system being targeted, whether it be their ground or space components or the link between them, also increases, with potentially significant consequences for civilians on Earth. And this is why this becomes also an issue of humanitarian concern. So in our view, possible threats to space systems include electronic warfare, cyber attacks, directed energy attacks, orbital-based and ground-based anti-satellite weapons, among others. But whatever military activities take place in outer space, it is constrained by existing international law. However, in the meantime, in our view, there are two interwoven aspects that are to be addressed in future multilateral discussion. So for one thing, for the protection of civilian population and civilian infrastructure, in the view of the ICRC, any common understanding of how best to act to reduce threats to space systems among states should include recognizing that military operations in outer space do not occur in a legal vacuum, but are constrained by existing law, notably the Outer Space Treaty, the UN Charter, and international humanitarian law, including prohibiting and limiting the use of certain weapons, means, and methods of warfare. And secondly, as civilian life today increasingly relies on space objects, military operations affecting these objects entails a risk of significant human cost on Earth. However, the exact scope of the potential consequences of these activities is uncertain and will certainly merit further analysis. In our view, it is notably critical to consider the harmful impacts of directly or incidentally disrupting, damaging, destroying, or disabling satellites that support safety-critical civilian activities and essential civilian services on Earth. So these are the two aspects that we recommend any future multilateral processes and discussions to address in an inclusive and open manner. We also appreciate the opportunity to be able to continue to contribute our expertise to the future discussions if states deem appropriate. Thank you.
My first question is looking at counterspace technology testing. Many states have criticized the testing of counterspace technology, but have shied away from calling it illegal. Why do you think that is? And what do you believe that, and do you believe that more clarity and regulations regarding this issue is needed? Maybe we can start with Wen, please.
Indeed, from the legal perspective, testing of weapons, including ascent weapons, is not unregulated. So I would like to probably just to kick off the discussion by shedding some light on some of the most relevant existing international legal rules on these issues, but this is in no case to be addressed in an exclusive manner. But I would like to start with the Outer Space Treaty. As we know, Outer Space Treaty have set some limitations on military activities. In particular, in Article 4 of the treaty, it was mentioned that the testing of any types of weapons and the conduct of military maneuvers on the moon and other celestial bodies are forbidden. So another article that would be, in my view, of relevance would be Article 9 of the same treaty, including the avoidance of harmful contamination to space and celestial bodies. States are asked to avoid harmful contamination of outer space and adverse changes in the environment of the Earth resulting from the introduction of such activities. So unnecessary states are also suggested or required to adopt appropriate measures for the purpose. And also in the same article, you have this due regard principle. So states shall conduct all of their activities in outer space and on celestial bodies with due regard to the corresponding interest of other states. And another mechanism of international law that I would see relevant to consider would be the obligations of legal review of new weapons, means, and method of warfare, in accordance with notably Article 36 of the Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. But it is also in our view that all states have an interest to conduct legal review, whether or not party to this protocol. So here, states are required to review the legality of any new space weapon, means, or method of warfare that they would decide to develop or acquire. Of course, during the course of development of a weapon, testing would be a necessary step to ascertain whether the employment of such a weapon would be in compliance with international humanitarian law or not. So here, of course, the space weapons would include not only kinetic ones, but also non-kinetic ones, not only space-based, but also ground-based. So here, I would also like to recall that international law also prohibits weapons of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, and also it is prohibited to emplace or use weapons that are indiscriminate by nature. So I think all these rules are relevant to consider the legality of testing of a given weapon, including those that are going to be used in relation to outer space. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Haiyang, do you have thoughts on this issue?
We noticed that some international community have concerns on the anti-satellite counterspace technology testing. I think it's when it comes to a legal term, I think it's complex to define the testing of a counter technology as illegal. Firstly, the threshold for counterspace technology is not high. Many technology, including that for missile defense system or on-orbit clearance of space debris, also has a potential for counterspace purposes. So the definition, in terms of legal term, so the definition of a counterspace technology will be very complex, especially when involved the distinction of the intention of a space activity. And secondly, we cannot just focus on one single form of counterspace technology, such as direct ascent, kinetic attack, while leaving other forms untouched. If so, you will give us an impression that other forms of counter-space technology are legal actions. Just as Dr. Zhou said, such testing are not is not regulated in line with the existing international legal framework. So that highlights that one thing that we need to negotiate a new legally binding instrument on perils to regulate such kind of counter technology testing. And the PPWT proposed by China and Russia provided a good basis for that. The PPWT have mainly two obligations. One is prohibition of placement of our weapons in our space, and the other is prohibition of threat or use of force against space objects. That will cover the issue of counter space technology, no matter it's from space to face or space to surface or surface to space. So I think that will address the international society's concern on testing counter space technology. Here, I just urge all parties concerned to join the efforts to negotiate such kind of a legally binding instrument to regulate the counter space testing. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben, do you have thoughts on this matter?
I'd like to just hone in on that second part. So what types of clarity might we seek to address the issue of counterspace technologies and their legality or their uses in or their considerations as acts of war? I think that the due regard clause is really, really important here. And that's one of the things that it always is. We just, as a community of space interested people, we generally just tend to think, oh yeah, due regard, it's very tough to define. Let's move on to the next question, please. So it can be difficult and it's thorny and it's uncomfortable and nobody really has a great answer to it, but there must be an answer of what due regard really means. And if that's mitigating any sort of debris that you create, that's an answer. It's an uncomfortable answer. I wish it wasn't the only answer, and I don't think it is the only answer. So the understanding what due regard means, and then on top of that, the next layer in this cake would be to understand the liability that one would assume if due regard is not taken. If we can establish a standard of care for space, then we can really start. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but that makes these questions and conversations a little bit difficult sometimes. But if we can establish that standard of care, and if we can understand what due regard means, and if we have a universal understanding of what due regard means, not just pockets of I think due regard means this, and someone else and their friends think that it's that, then maybe we can have a more cohesive conversation on the legality or illegality of these types of space activities, whether they're debris creating counter space tests, or if they're directed energy but don't necessarily create debris. There are degrees at which we can say certain things are illegal because you did not practice due regard, and certain things are potentially we'd rather you not do that, but we can condemn it without calling it illegal.
I've been notified that someone in the room wants to jump in here. Eric Desatel from the US, do you have the floor?
Thanks, Victoria. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to, first of all, participate in this conference in person. Really excited to do that. But also thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question. In particular, I have a question for Deputy Director Lai. I noticed your concerns about the creation of space forces or space commands. And I was hoping you could help us understand, are there similarities or differences between the U.S. Space Force, which you have noted as a concern, and China's strategic support force, especially as we think about their roles or doctrines? Are there differences that will help us understand the differences between the two entities that both of our countries have? Thank you.
It's a really good question. And one question for you or for the audience, for all the audience, there's one country overtly declared the space as a warfighting domain. That is, I think that's not just a declaration of strategy or doctrine, but a threat to this space security. And I noticed on August 23rd, there's a report that the U.S. is going to declassify a secret space weapon. So I think this needs to be clarified. And for your question, I think there's one more thing need to emphasize, that the U.S. pursued a space dominance strategy. That is to pursue absolute superiority, absolute freedom, and even to control the space. And that will undermine they will harm the global strategic stability. And that is not helpful for the international peace and security. And I think every nation have a right to maintain their security in space, but not in the manner as the US did. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on some of the issues that were raised in the panelists' responses. Looking at the inputs from UNGA 7536, there seem to be some common threads emerging in terms of what states thought would be helpful to ensure the space security and stability of the domain. And one of them was that the idea of deliberate creation of long-lived debris is a bad idea. That seems to be, I think we're all pretty much in agreement on that one. So if that's the case, I'm curious to hear the panelists' thoughts about the possibility for some sort of kinetic energy anti-satellite test ban in the future. Ben, you want to take this one and we'll go down the line?
Absolutely, yes. So I think that's a great question. I think you're absolutely right that there was a common thread through a lot of the state responses and even the observer responses to the UK's resolution. And I'm very thankful to the Secretary General for putting together that report. I hate to respond to a question with another question, but it really does lead us down a road to defining what long-lived is. If we're going to ban long-lived debris, was that long-lived in terms of, and at that point we're really talking about the altitudes at which that debris exists, generally. Is that debris above 500 kilometers? Is that debris above 250 kilometers? Is that anything that's not suborbital debris? Is that debris above the geobelt? That's incredibly long-lived debris, but the risks that debris above the geobelt would pose, it would be significantly less in some assessments than debris in a very heavily populated, with active satellites at least, low Earth orbit. So I think that is a good starting point, and it raises a really good question. And I think that there is a ton of room for states to discuss what long-lived means. But again, it's just the definitions of these terms and the intent the intent that states have in defining these terms really needs to be clarified before we can just put long-lived into some sort of binding agreement, or even a non-binding agreement that would not having a diffuse or a fuzzy definition would really potentially make more trouble than otherwise.
That is definitely important on this one. Thank you. Wen, what are your thoughts on the possibility of a KEA sat test ban?
Well, I would say that we really welcome the continued discussion on this issue, but without prejudicing the final outcome. I think it's probably too early to predict, but we certainly hope that from the humanitarian protection perspective, in our view, weaponization of outer space is not inevitable, but a choice. So in this regard, nothing prevents states from agreeing on additional rules to set further prohibition or limitation on specific military activities or space or weapons in outer space. They have done that in the Outer Space Treaty, and there are also other arms control anti-disarmament treaties in other domains. So, but in any case, in our view, this development of new norms or legally binding rules should always be consistent with the existing rule and should aim at building on and strengthening the existing legal framework. And here again, I have to stress that the existing legal framework includes notably Outer Space Treaty, the UN Charter, and international humanitarian law. Thanks.
Thank you, Wen. I think that's a really important point. Oftentimes when we hear discussions about space security, people seem to think we're starting from scratch. And of course, we're not. We have 5 decades of legal frameworks to build on. Haiyang, what are your thoughts about a kinetic energy ASAT test ban?
I think the prevention of arms race is the common consensus of international society since 1981. The UN General Assembly has passed resolutions on perils with an overwhelming majority, and requesting the CD to negotiate a legally binding treaty, an instrument on perils. And for nearly 40 years, we see the CD has not achieved substantive progress. And as for now, just we talked about the security situation. We think it's the importance and urgency of negotiating such a kind of legally binding instrument is become more and more prominent. And we think the first, a legally binding instrument is necessary in that it strikes a proper balance between obligation and the right. So it can be it can address the a different the concern of different countries, and as such can be observed in a good faith. And second, we think a legally binding treaty it's obligatory. So when one country join the treaty, they cannot just withdraw that easily. And second, and third, we think there's a gap between the existing legally binding legally framework and the reality. So we think we need to fill the gap. So we need to negotiate a legally binding instrument at an early date. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much, first of all, for this really substantive and interesting presentation about on the vision about the threats and challenges in outer space. I have the question related to some interventions about the resolution 7536. And I'd like just to better understand how this initiative and this resolution relates to the current threats and challenges in outer space. It was said that it is related to mostly to the long-term space debris, but I would be excited to understand whether this initiative, from your point of view, and it is the question to all the panelists, should be comprehensive and relates to all the mentioned and reflected challenges and threats in outer space, or you think it would be just limited by this really specific and specialized matter as space debris? Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps we could start with Haiyang, please.
I think we're talking about space threats and threats and changes. Actually, through the background introduction of this panel, we are actually discussing something related to weaponization and arms race in our space, not space debris. I understand some country link the space debris to some military actions. They use some words like long-lived space debris, deliberately created, and so create a link between space debris and military space action. Actually, I think space debris is in the scope of peaceful use of outer space, not in the scope of perils. And this kind of issue should be discussed within the framework of the UN Corpus, and should be discussed at the proper platform. And we should not mix them up, mix the space debris with other issues such as weaponization, arms race, and should not talk about less important issues like space debris, while ignore the real biggest and fundamental space threats and challenges. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben, do you have any thoughts on the question about the relevance of 7536 to threats and challenges to space?
I would hesitate to call 7536 exclusively focused on debris, but debris is, of course, inextricably linked to certain types of ASAT tests and ASAT capabilities. Should we be more comprehensive in our opinions about 7536? Absolutely. There were a wide variety of diverse opinions from states all around the world. I think that each one of them had merits. I think that the process of hosting this type of discussion in a broader forum than may have otherwise been available, like the Conference on Disarmament, which is limited, giving everybody the opportunity to discuss their perceptions of the threats to space. I think that that's a huge benefit to this process, and 7536 allowed for that to happen. You had opinions from states that are extremely reliant on space for almost every aspect of basic social function, including military and state governance. And you had opinions from states who are hoping to get to that point or pursuing that sometime in the future. That's I think maybe not the benefit, but one of the extreme benefits of hosting a resolution at the GA, or sponsoring a resolution at the GA rather, and hosting this type of discussion there as opposed to other places, because it does let you get that extremely comprehensive view, and it's not simply focused on one type of threat, a security threat. It could be focused on miscommunication when dealing with on-orbit servicing. That's a huge threat to some, and it's incredibly important to hear that opinion voiced in a formal setting, in a documented setting.
I think from the national and submissions, and also submissions from other non-state actors earlier this year, we see that indeed there are some common threads. Many submissions address similar concerns and issues, and I think also there are all these submissions we can also see there are some common elements that could probably be used to form the basis for further discussion, including affirming the applicability of international law. Many submissions indeed mentioned debris mitigation, but not only debris mitigation, and also restrictions on various forms of behaviors. From the ICRC's perspective, we're really happy that now in a few days in the first committee, these discussions will move forward, and a new draft resolution is in the making. So from our perspective, we indeed hope that this new body, possibly the open-ended working group, will ensure an open and inclusive process for exchanges of views between states, international organizations, and other stakeholders. And we hope that this new body will be ensured a broad mandate, so that issues such as how existing legal framework would apply in outer space, and also the in-depth discussion on the potential impacts, including humanitarian impacts of irresponsible behaviors in outer space. Because these issues, as we can see from today's discussion, and we can see from today's discussion, there are many issues that are well, I think we need more time to discuss, and also to deliberate, so that states can eventually reach some common understanding. And but in any case, as I've already said a few times today, we believe that any future discussions must be structured in such a way that are consistent with and build on existing.
I'm going to jump in here. My organization, the Secure World Foundation, submitted as part of civil society our input to UNGA 75/36. And one of the points that I thought was really relevant for the discussion, and why I think it's so important to helping space security and stability, is that hopefully by having a discussion of threats and responsible behavior, it allows the international community to come to more of a consensus in terms of what the biggest threats are to space security and stability. It's very hard to solve a problem if you can't even agree on what the question is. And so perhaps having this conversation allows the community to refocus their thoughts and looking at a different approach to allow for some more productive conversations, to be honest, on this issue, as opposed to having the same discussions for decades now. I'd like to ask a question to the group about a statement I read recently by Todd Harrison with the Center for Strategic International Studies. He said he thinks we're currently in a space race. But he said, unlike the space race of the 1960s, the goal of this race is not a destination. The real objective of this race is to see who can build the broadest and strongest international coalition in space. In terms of that, we're talking prevention of arms race in outer space. You know, it's important to have coalition building. It's important to discuss technological concerns. It's important to discuss responsible behavior. I'm curious to hear what you guys think about this statement about the arms race is more towards a coalition as opposed to a destination. Maybe you'll start with Ben on this one.
First off, he's not wrong. That this is, I think that was a very important and a great observation that was well communicated in his testimony before the House Science Committee. It's one of those things that I think the intent in why states are trying to build these coalitions, whether that's through documented and established written commitments or through things like infrastructure development around the world that's related to space, building spaceports. I think the intent is incredibly important, and I think that's one of the things that if states can better communicate that, potentially the mistrust and the misperception would be, you can buy the risks down on those things, because it's important to understand why somebody is doing something. That way, you know potentially how to respond, how your response is going to be considered. Those are very important things that if you're only able to interpret a state's actions through a fuzzy lens, or if you're unable to really pin it down, in your response is going to be equally, if not more, imprecise. The reason for coalition building might just be to benefit all states and to make sure that activities on the moon are safe. That's a very well-intentioned goal, and frankly, all states should be interested in making sure that activities on the moon are safe. The physics are different than here on Earth, and we have to take that into consideration when we're doing things and interacting with each other far into the future, potentially not that far into the future, but setting rules is a good idea now, so that when we get there, it's not anarchy, frankly. To the extent that coalition building is potentially for other reasons, that might be something that people should be talking about and having frank conversations about why a state made decision X as opposed to making decision Y. How that supports their overall strategy is very important.
Thoughts from the other panelists? Perhaps Haiyang, do you have thoughts on this issue?
Benjamin talked about the intent. Intent is important. I think mentality is also very important. If you stick to the Cold War mentality, you pursue the hegemony, pursue absolute superiority, and that will not help for building mutual trust. And if you build the sense of security, at the cost of other countries' sense of security, that will not accepted and not sustainable. And I think one thing we propose is it's a kind of a security. It's a vision of security. We have proposed. It is the vision of a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable global security. I think this kind of a mentality should replace, the Cold War mentality. I think that will help, address the current political dilemma. the political dilemma that someone pursue some hegemony, but that will exacerbate the trend of arms race. Thank you.
Thank you. Wen, do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Well, indeed, I think this question probably is beyond my depth, but I would like to probably just to divert my answers to a different track, but related, I hope. But well, indeed, we have also observed that many states are investing heavily in developing capabilities that could be used in outer space or counter outer space objects, and this is also, I think, coincide with the overall phenomenon that we have been seeing, that many states are investing also heavily in the development of weapons, means, and method of warfare that are relying on new and emerging technologies. So today we are talking about, in particular, cyber technologies, sensor systems, robotics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. And even newer ones like quantum technology, etc. So these technologies are also being used to develop space capabilities, and well, these technologies may eventually change the way conflicts are conducted. I think there are many issues today that are interwoven and really require international community to look at these issues from a more holistic approach, in a more holistic approach, because, for example, the other discussions also would have a bearing on the discussions here. And today we see that most probably that a space object could be interfered or even disabled. That means temporarily make this space object dysfunctional, not through a kinetic means, but through a non-connected means. You can use laser weapons, you can use cyber attack. But the question is, how would you see these attacks? How would you see the attack? Well, if it is a non-kinetic attack, would it be considered as attack under international humanitarian law, for example? And how to assess the lawfulness of such actions? How do we see the foreseeable direct damage and harm to civilian objects, and how about the indirect harms? So I think these issues really require like more holistic approach and discussion, instead of put problems in the silos. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question. The international space community often talks about the prevention of arms race in outer space. Do you believe it is successfully working towards this goal? And if so, why? If not, why? And if not, what mechanisms are working and which could be improved upon? Haiyang, how about you start us off with this one?
I do think we are working towards the goal of Paris, but it's hard to say successfully. Since 1981, the UNGA passed the resolutions every year, emphasizing the importance and urgency of Paris and requesting the CD to negotiate a legally binding instrument on Paris. And the CD, the UNDC, and UNGA First Committee, Fourth Committees also conducted a lot of meaningful work. They complement each other in serving the common goal of Paris. Through this discussion, the international society has gathered political will and brought consensus on Paris. But unfortunately, there's one country, I say, is reluctant to see its space military capabilities being restricted and unwilling to join the process of space arms control. In 2019, this country blocked single-handedly the UNGGE on Paris to adopt an outcome document. I think to improve the relevant, mechanism, I think the first and the foremost thing is that all nations should exhibit political will to join the process of Paris. As a suggestion, we think we should start the work of the CD as soon as possible to negotiate a legally binding instrument on Paris. Before that, we could do some work. We can utilize the work of the UNGGE and continue discussion on technical issues like the scope, definition, verification of a legally binding instrument, a possible legally binding instrument, and we can establish a technical expert group under the CD as a subsidiary body, or establish a UN OEWG to discuss these issues, to create some to get prepared for the negotiation of legally binding instrument on Paris. Thank you.
Thank you. Wen, do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Thank you. I don't think the ICRC is in a position to really comment on the best venue to move forward the discussion. But as I said a few times here, we really appreciate that this discussion is now moving forward without prejudice to the avenue or the formality. We believe that again, when we look at how to further regulate or let's say minimize the threat to space systems, it is important to bear in mind that any new development of these rules, if it is going to be voluntary norms or principles or rules or voluntary norms, states' legal obligation should not be altered states' legal obligation under existing law should not be altered as a result of the development of voluntary norms. On the flip side, if it is the legally binding rules that are to be developed, they should not undermine the existing legal framework either. Thank you.
Thank you, Wen. Ben, do you have thoughts on this issue?
I hate to be the odd one out here, but I do believe that the prevention aspect of the Paros debate is probably a little past its expiration date. Based on some work that I did the last time I was in Geneva, we issued, UNIDIR published a paper that basically laid out 3 indicators of arms racing, and that it was, first, you have to have at least 2 states in a rivalrous or potentially even adversarial relationship. 2, the capabilities, the arms that they're building have to be at least in relation. It wouldn't make a ton of sense if I was building landmines and you were building fighter jets. That's not really an arms race at all. And the third part, which is the most difficult indicator to identify, is that there has to, this phenomenon has to be different than your normal status quo. And unfortunately, the states do have a general pattern of arms development that increases year over year. The arms race is a specific aspect of that where you would see a sharp increase. And to observe that, you have to usually use some proxy indicators like, have we seen an increase in testing recently? Have we seen doctrinal shifts that make it easier for states to apply these types of weapons in combat? Have we heard about a lot more R&D dollars going to it, to the extent that you can combine R&D dollars apples to apples? So I do think that the prevention aspect, we are probably outside the point at which we can prevent it. Unfortunately, I wish we could. The good news is that states are still interested in discussing the arms race, but I do think that there are better or more fruitful opportunities for talking about arresting the arms race. And that's just the arms race in general, based on existing geopolitical rivalries and geopolitical tensions between states on Earth. It's not necessarily strictly limited to space. Obviously, we've said this many, many times, and I'm sure it will be a common theme throughout the rest of the conference, that space systems are inextricably linked to almost everything we do on Earth, whether that is conventional warfighting, whether that's nuclear systems, whether that's just command and control of fill in the blank, it's very difficult to say that we can address an arms race in space without addressing things on Earth, whether that's attenuating the geopolitical rivalries or thinking about more distinct ways to address specific systems. But we've been using outdated paradigms for a long time in addressing and translating those paradigms in ways that don't really make sense to this entirely different domain in space, when perhaps those paradigms were better suited to focus on specific capabilities here on Earth. So if we can pivot, maybe the idea is not necessarily Paros prevention of an arms race, but Pharos focusing on arresting the arms race in space or something like that. I mean, the acronym is the acronym it's going to be, but the conversation, I think, should be shifting more toward how can we slow it down, arrest it, and in doing that, can we also focus on making sure that the arms race, as it's just another form of international competition, doesn't turn into outright hostilities and war. It is certainly preferable to not have war. Whatever else may be on the left side of that, that's much better than war. So if we can focus on ways that don't lead to war and ways that move us further back from that ledge, if people want to call that prevention of an arms race in our space, that's fine with me. But I do think that we are past the point at which prevention is a viable option and a prudent way to use diplomatic capital and diplomatic resources.
Thank you, Ben. We have someone in the room that has a question. David Edmondson, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Victoria, and to the panelists. Really interesting stuff that we've got going on today at the conference, and really nice to see us getting into some of the harder elements here, because I think that's important. If we're going to have a space security conference, then we should be talking about why we're worried about space security. So you might have to translate this from an opinion into a question, although hopefully it'll lead us there. If you'll pardon me, just a thought or two, because I'm the author of 7536, and I thought, those on the call and those on the panel would sort of like to respond to why we undertook the work in the first place. What's really interesting listening to some of the discussions today, throughout the day, has been this idea that Paros is just about big kinetic things that go bang, and the real dangers that somehow exist only because we can destroy something in outer space. And this is where the interesting parts about the PPWT and the threat of the use of force and so on become quite limiting, because it would not cover those weapons that exist and are being used at the moment below the threat or the threshold of absolute destruction of a satellite. And for most of us who are involved in arms control discussions more widely, the interesting part for us is how to deal with those activities that are very dangerous, detrimental and damaging to our systems, but don't actually constitute the use of force. So I'd like it, I think we'll come on to some of those discussions tomorrow, I think in a couple of panels in the morning. But it'd be really interesting to hear from the panelists whether they agree that the use of RF jamming against our satellite communications, which goes on right now, or lasing of satellites to prevent imaging of, say, missile silos to see if the hatches are open or closed, which is going on right now, is acceptable, or whether those activities would contribute to an arms race, and therefore whether those activities should be dealt with. And if you can't legislate for those, if you can't come up with a treaty, our view, as the authors of 7536, was that behaviours was a good approach and a way of trying to limit miscalculation and escalation against space systems, noting that most of the threats come from Earth and not deployed in space. So I thought here, let's take it back to basics, to the actual title of the discussion here, which is about threats and the growing threats and why they matter. And perhaps, Victoria, you could turn that into a question for me, please, as to if the panelists agree that the most dangerous thing going on right now is activity, sub-conflict, competition phase activity that could take us into miscalculation and escalation, and that responsible behaviours, we believe, has utility, and whether we should engage. Well, we will continue to promote the open-ended working group and the draft resolution because we think it's useful, and we'd like to really move away from this old argument, this quite, in our view, tired argument that it's only about things that go bang in space that matter. Thank you.
A lot to unpack there. So I guess for the panelists who would like to take this on, perhaps Haiyang, what are your thoughts about David's question?
About responsible behavior, my general response is that I think the principle, the initiative on responsible space behavior is inclusive to bring the intention of internet society to space security and to focus on one side of the space threats and challenges. It's in this from this perspective, we think it's useful, and we think it's meaningful to discuss responsible behavior because it's in nature. It's TCP. It's one of the TCPMs, and it's conducive for the process of perils, and but it cannot replace the negotiation of arms control in space. The responsible, there's some, how say the weakness, or say inefficiency of the initiative or responsible space behavior, because it indicates the binary of distinction of responsible behavior and irresponsible behavior, and that's not a legal term, and cannot develop a legally binding instrument based on responsible behavior, no matter it is principles or norms or rules. As for the jamming, the activities of jamming, or say the laser attack, we think the PPWT can cover the concern. The PPWT has two main obligations. One is a prohibition of the placement of weapons in outer space, and the other is the threat of a use of force against the space objects. It depends on how you define the use of a force. I think if we can managing the definition of use of force, we can address the concern on the jamming and laser attack, I think in a more comprehensive way. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, that raises a very interesting question, perhaps to be more directed towards Wen. How would you define use of force?
Thanks, Victoria, for directing the question to me. I would like to stress that indeed there's often confusion between the notion of armed attack under Article 51 of the UN Charter and the notion of attack under international humanitarian law. I would say I want to stress that these two terms are not the same, and for the purpose of IHL, attack is defined as acts of violence against the adversary, whether in defense or in offense. So I think indeed we have seen this sort of confusion, and also from the ongoing discussions in other relative subject matters in arms control, in particular in cyber warfare. I think I have mentioned that, for example, it is very clear that a kinetic operation against a space object would constitute an attack under IHL, but as has been discussed here, the use of direct energy weapons or a cyber attack against, say, military satellite or a dual-use satellite, that probably would not physically destroy the satellite, but still would make this space objects disabled or at least temporarily dysfunctional. So in the ICRC's view, if such kinetic operations take place, that would also constitute attack under IHL. But we clearly have seen that from the ongoing discussion in cyber warfare, for example, there is no consensus yet on this issue. So the question of if operation that would lead to a loss of functionality of an object or a system without physically damaging it, yeah, so would that constitute an attack under IHL? That's a question. So I think these issues probably would have its weight in the future discussions in different fora, and probably this also really need a more focused discussion so that we can also see clearly how to regulate issues that would be clearly below all this threshold. Thank you.
Interesting question that came in through the Q&A. How will different parties work towards determining the intent of other parties, particularly since we're talking about behavior or even just technological development? Perhaps, Ben, you could start us off with that one.
It's difficult, and it comes down to trust. Do you trust what somebody else is saying that they are intending to do, even when you observe it and are made uncomfortable by the results of that action? I think that a lot of it is getting a better handle on what signaling means to different states and what signals are acceptable and unacceptable. And if you can determine that, or if you can at least get a better handle on it, maybe get it a little bit crisper around the edges, you can have a better time signaling your intent to somebody else and have that intent be well received and trusted. It is difficult though. I mean, there's a lot of everybody sighs when you say transparency and confidence building measures, because those are very fuzzy and uncomfortable. But at the same time, that's what it comes down to. It comes down to discussing and having open discussions of, there was an ambiguous thing that just happened in space. Can you please explain? And if we get to the point where that explanation is accepted and trusted and the intent of it is well communicated, it sort of reinforces it. It is a reinforcing aspect of having these types of discussions in the future, and whether that's setting up specific space-related communications channels, whether that's engaging in multinational discussions on related topics, not necessarily that specific capability, but things like the IADC, the Interagency Debris Committee. Those types of discussions and those types of forums bring states together in ways that they otherwise may not engage, and sets the table, at least. Maybe it doesn't enforce these types of conversations, but it sets the table for it to happen. The longer you engage in those conversations, I would hope the more trust is built, especially in the scientific community, and hopefully that's cross-pollinated into the security community. And based on that chain, I'm under no impressions that this is a fast-moving way to do this. But I'm not sure that there's a better way, a more efficient way. I wish there was, again. But to be able to have better communications between states, and to be able to say, we thought that was something else, could you please not do it again? It made us very uncomfortable. And to say, oh, we did not intend for that to make anybody uncomfortable. That was just a normal test. That would be a really great way to set up communications, or at least better signaling of intent.
I think the first thing come to my mind is communication. I think communication is very important to judge the intent of other countries, especially when it comes to space activity. Without communication, we can only judge from the declaration or the strategy doctrine of that country. Published. I think some TCBM measures like communication or some commitment, some declaration of commitment to things like no first placement, things like that will help judge the intent. I hope that can answer this question. Thank you.
I think indeed I agree with the other two panelists. This is very difficult to ascertain intent, and indeed, given the scale of the outer space capability development, in any misunderstanding or miscalculation would probably result in catastrophic consequences, in particular for civilians. In the meantime, from a legal perspective, that's why I agree that it's very important that states build trust and find solutions to avoid any misunderstanding or miscalculation in this respect. But from legally speaking point of view, I would say that the reason why it is very important is, as we know, Geneva Conventions apply to all types of armed conflict, and in this common Article 2, it says it applies to all cases of declared war or any other armed conflict which may arise between one or two or more states. So here does not, declaration of war is already, let's say, obsolete concept. States stopped doing that since quite some years. In the meantime, it is indeed that there should be a belligerent intent, as we call it. So if it's let's say if in a normal circumstances on land or at sea, if there is a mistake to be made, then this can be addressed and to be clarified. Say that there is no belligerent intent, so armed conflict can be avoided. However, the intent is so difficult to ascertain. So what we really look at is what is happening on the not on the ground, in outer space or on the battlefield, so to speak. So it is really look at what is happening and if there is a continuance of such behaviors. So I think that is why it is very important to avoid any misunderstanding between states.
Thank you, Wen. I think we have time for one last question. I'd like to know the panelists' thoughts if there are any meaningful ways to engage on and potentially limit non-kinetic counterspace capabilities, both cyber and electronic warfare.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the earlier question posed by the gentleman about Paros focusing on, or our discussion of Paros focusing on specifically kinetic things and things that go boom. The one aspect that I would like to point out is that those tend to be the most observable types of capabilities. I'm not saying that the lasing and the GPS spoofing or RF blocking isn't observable. But it is very verifiable that somebody has just blown up your satellite. That's pretty difficult to hide. So it is very important. Obviously, it's important to address these non-kinetic factors. It is equally damaging to, I mean, if your intent is to disable someone's ability to observe your somethings, whatever that may be, you can either lays the optical factors on those satellites, and if you do it in such a broad way and address so many aspects of that satellite system, that's about as good as using a kinetic tool to force those satellites to stop working in any way. It doesn't really matter. The end result is that the satellites don't work anymore. One just created a bunch of debris, one did something else. So it's hugely important, and I really hope that the conversation that we just had doesn't convince anybody that we've lost sight of the importance of these things like directed energy, like cyber. It's really truly just in my opinion, that the kinetic aspects are so obvious and so easily observed that we really can make potentially more immediate headway on those, and then build enough goodwill and trust to focus on things that are a little bit harder to define or declare, or to, sometimes people don't even like saying and admitting that their satellites have been interfered with successfully, whether that's through a cyber attack or a directed energy or a ground-based laser, because that admits that your system doesn't work, and that's not the case. If something were to be interfered with a kinetic interceptor, you can't really hide that. So to be sure, they are very important. I really do hope that the conversation hasn't left anybody with a sour taste. knowing that we do take those seriously, and we're very much looking forward to addressing them. It's just that KE stuff, kinetic energy things, happen to be probably, in my opinion, the most obvious starting points.
I just wanted to also emphasize one thing that I think I haven't said yet, because I keep bringing about IHL, but I wanted to put it on the record that the acknowledging IHL applies is when this misunderstanding or miscalculation happens, and that's important because IHL provides this framework to provide protection for civilians and other protected persons. So this is not to justify in any way the use of force in outer space. This is not our intent here. So in connection with that, I already said, well, it is possible that the non-connected attacks on space objects may constitute attack under IHL. And in these cases, when assessing the lawfulness of these attacks, we really have to consider all the foreseeable direct, but also indirect incidental harm and damage to civilian objects. This is the something that really needs to be taken into account when armed forces conduct this proportionality test. And this is in particular important because many space objects are dual-use objects. So you have to look at not only the civilian function of these dual-use objects, but also the reverberating effects of attacking such dual-use objects on the civilian life and the essential civilian services on Earth. So the same calculation has to go to the risk calculation of behaviors that would create space debris. Thank you.
Thank you. Haiyang, you have the last thoughts on this matter, or any other last thoughts you'd like to share with the group?
Thank you. I think this question is kind of hard for me. It's beyond my expertise, knowledge. I think it's hard to observe the damage or effects of the non-kinetic attack against space assets, because the effects may be not observed in time, because of technical reason, or the effect is revertible. I think as this issue is complex, so we need to establish a technical group, or say a UNGGE, to further discuss this issue. I think that's necessary. Thank you.
This is such a fascinating discussion. Please join me in thanking the panelists for their really thoughtful insight. Thank you very much.